The diagnostic results came back at 0600 station time, which was either the Veth being efficient or the Veth being cruel. And after 2 weeks aboard Tessellation Station, I still hadn't figured out which impulse drove most of what they did. Probably both. With the Veth, it was usually both. Initiate Vasquez. Crystallographer tactician Sane didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The briefing chamber had acoustics so precise that a Veth instructor could whisper from the podium and the sound would arrive at every seat like a personal delivery. It was the kind of architecture that said, "We thought about this more than you thought it was possible to think about anything. Your aggregate diagnostic score is 412 points." I already knew this. I'd seen the numbers come through on my bunk terminal at 0545, which meant I'd had 15 minutes to make peace with my situation before having to sit in a room and have it read aloud by a being made mostly of geometric angles and quiet disappointment. "The cohort average," Sang continued, "is 971. Someone in the row behind me made a sound. Not quite a laugh. The Veth didn't laugh. Exactly, but the closest approximation their physiology allowed, which was a short crystalline click produced somewhere in the chest cavity. Like ice dropping into a glass. Several of them did it at once. I looked at my hands on the desk in front of me and thought, okay, we're doing this. To provide context, Sen said, and I got the feeling he wasn't providing context for my benefit. The previous station record low was 533, set 11 cycles ago by an initiate of the Drovathi species who later distinguished himself considerably in the outer campaigns. The margin between that record and Initiate Vasquez's current score is 121 points. This is... He paused in the way that meant he was selecting precise language, notable, more ice dropping into glasses. I smiled at my hands. Not because it was funny exactly, more because I was doing the math on something I'd decided before I ever boarded the transport to Tessellation Station. I was going to be the best combat-rated human in this cohort by the time I left. Or I was going to be the most interesting failure anyone had ever watched try. Either outcome was fine by me. Neither outcome involved me being embarrassed. Initiate Vasquez. Sane again. You are smiling. Yes, sir. You understand what has been communicated. Completely, sir. A pause. With the Veth, pauses were load-bearing. This one held about 400 kilograms of what might have been curiosity and might have been concern. In Veth culture, Sen said carefully, a smile in response to public failure of this magnitude is a formal acknowledgement that one intends to withdraw from the endeavor. I'm aware of that, sir. You are not withdrawing. No, sir. Another pause. Heavier this time. Then what? Sen said. Are you communicating? I looked up at him. Then his crystalline frame, the faceted planes of his face, the way light moved through him slightly differently than it moved through air. I'd read everything I could get my hands on about Veth psychology before the posting. I knew that direct eye contact from a human registered to them as something between aggressive and baffling. I held it anyway. I'm communicating that I just found out how far I have to go, I said. That's useful information. I like having useful information. Sane looked at me for 3 full seconds, which for a Veth was approximately the equivalent of a human staring at something so long their coffee got cold. Then he moved on to the next set of scores without another word. The ice drop sounds had stopped. My bunkmate, Rael, was waiting outside the briefing chamber when I came out. Rael was Veth, junior track, billeted with the standard initiates, for reasons that had something to do with a housing allocation algorithm and everything to do with the Tessellation Station administrative team not having anticipated that a human would show up. I'd been assigned to the alien physiology barracks almost as an afterthought, and Rael had been assigned to me the same way you assign someone to manage an anomaly. He was good at it, actually. Better than I'd expected from a species that communicated primarily through geometric precision and strategic silence. The cohort believes you will request reassignment within 3 days, Rael said, falling into step beside me. He was taller than me, by about half a meter, and the station corridors weren't designed for mixed species walking, so every hallway was a negotiation. The cohort is optimistic, I said. I'm going to be here for the full cycle. The full cycle concludes with the final assessment. I'm aware. You currently have no realistic mathematical path to a passing score in the final assessment. Also aware. Rael was quiet for a moment. When Veth went quiet mid-conversation, it meant they were processing something that didn't fit their existing models, which, with me, happened roughly every 4 hours. I'd started thinking of it as a compliment. You intend to improve your scores sufficiently to pass, he said finally. Not a question. More like a hypothesis he was testing for structural integrity. I intend to improve my scores sufficiently to make Sen have to recalibrate what he thinks passing means, I said, which is a different goal and a better one. Rael made the ice drop sound. Just once, and quieter than the ones in the briefing chamber? I'd learned by then that the volume and frequency of the sound tracked with something the Veth didn't have a good translation for the closest Rael had gotten was the sensation of encountering a variable you failed to account for in your model. It was, I had decided, the nicest thing a Veth could say to you without meaning to. The mid-cycle skirmish simulation is in 12 days, Rael said. I know. You have 12 days. I know that too. What will you do with them? I stopped walking and looked at him. The corridor light came through him at the angle it always did, splitting into component frequencies along his shoulder planes, making him look like a person-shaped prism. I'd gotten used to it. I'd gotten used to a lot of things faster than the Veth seemed to think was possible. Everything I'm not supposed to, I said. Rael processed this. That is not a training methodology recognized by the station curriculum. No, I agreed. It's not. I started walking again. Behind me, I heard the quiet, single sound of ice meeting glass. The skirmish simulation ran on a closed-course combat environment that the Veth had been refining for about 200 years, which you could tell because it was almost perfect and therefore, from a certain angle, completely predictable. I'd spent 12 days figuring out that angle. The course was built on Veth tactical theory, which was beautiful and precise and moved like a proof every element in its optimal position, every engagement window mathematically derived, every decision point weighted toward a single correct answer. If you trained inside the theory, the course rewarded you. The better you understood the theory, the higher your score. The Veth in my cohort had been training inside the theory their entire lives. I had not. The simulation opened with a standard insertion event, your avatar dropping into the environment at a randomized point. Opposition AI spawning from 3 fixed vectors. Objective marker placed at the geometric center of the map. The Veth approach was clean. Assess vectors, calculate optimal intercept path, neutralize opposition in order of threat gradient, reach objective. Efficient, elegant. Deeply committed to the idea that combat was a math problem with a knowable solution. My approach was different. I let the first opposition unit see me. In the Veth framework, this was an error. You minimized your exposure profile. You controlled information. You did not let the enemy know where you were before you had established positional advantage. In the framework I'd spent 12 nights working out on the back of a bunk terminal scratchpad function, letting the first unit see me was step 1 of something the Veth Tactical Library didn't have a name for. because no rational combatant had ever tried it. The opposition AI did what it was programmed to do. It signaled my position to the other 2 units and began executing the standard encirclement protocol. The 3 units moved to triangulate me. The course design assumed that a combatant caught in triangulation had 2 options: break for a gap in the triangle, or fortify position and take the engagement head-on. I went up. The course had a vertical dimension. Every Veth initiate knew this. It appeared in the briefing materials, it was diagrammed in the training schematics, and it was completely unused in actual skirmish runs because the optimal path to the objective was ground level, and adding vertical movement created kinetic inefficiencies that degraded your score in 3 separate metrics. I didn't care about 3 separate metrics. I cared about 1. Reach the objective first. I went vertical. Let the triangulation protocol run its course on empty ground. Dropped back down on the far side of all 3 units from a position the course geometry had never been asked to account for. Moved through the corridor they'd just vacated, which was now clear because they were busy encircling where they thought I was, and hit the objective marker 22 seconds faster than the course record. Then I went back and neutralized all 3 opposition units from behind because the scoring rubric required it and I wasn't leaving points on the table. The simulation ended. The score posted. I heard the room before I saw it. I was running on neural haptic feedback with the visual still loading out, so the first thing that reached me was sound, which was not, in a room full of Veth initiates, the ice drop click. It was something else, something I hadn't heard before on the station. Silence. The kind that meant everyone in the room had stopped doing what they were doing at exactly the same moment. Then Rael's voice, from somewhere to my left. Vasquez. Yeah, your score. I know. You broke the record. I know. You broke it by... And here he paused, which meant the number was large enough to require processing 214 points. I pulled the haptic rig off my head and blinked the room back into focus. Every Veth initiate in the simulation bay was oriented toward the scoring display. They weren't making the ice drop sound. They were doing the Veth thing, where they went very still, because their model had just encountered something that didn't fit, and they were running emergency recalculation. Sen was standing at the back of the room. I hadn't known he was there. Instructors didn't usually observe mid-cycle simulations. He was looking at the display, the way you look at a structural element that has just done something structural elements are not supposed to do. He stayed there for a long moment. Then he looked at me. Initiate Vasquez, he said. My office. After evening meal. Yes, sir, I said. Rael appeared at my shoulder. He has never requested a private meeting with an initiate before, he said quietly. I know. This is either very good or very bad. I know that too. Which do you think it is? I looked at the display one more time, at the number next to my name that had apparently caused Tessellation Station's scoring system to generate an automated flag, and thought about 12 days of doing everything I wasn't supposed to do. Honestly, I said, I think it's going to be interesting. Rael made the ice drop sound. Then, after a pause, he made it again. I'd never heard him do it twice in a row before. I decided to take that as a good sign. Zan's office was the most Veth room I'd seen on the station, which was saying something because the whole station was extremely Veth. Every surface was at a precise angle to every other surface. The light was the exact frequency that Veth visual processing found optimal, and the air temperature was about 3 degrees colder than what a human metabolism would choose if given the option. I sat in the chair he indicated, designed for Veth physiology, which meant I was sitting in it wrong, which meant I was going to be uncomfortable for this entire conversation and waited while he arranged himself across the desk with the geometric precision that Veth used instead of body language. "I have reviewed the simulation footage," he said, 4 times. "Okay. I have also reviewed the course parameters, the opposition AI decision trees, and the scoring rubric. Okay. I want to understand what you did." I looked at him. The light was coming through his planes at the evening angle, which was different from the morning angle and the midday angle, all of which I'd cataloged by this point more or less automatically. He was watching me with the unblinking attention that Veth used when they were genuinely curious, which looked from the outside like being studied by a very patient, very geometric bird of prey. "I used the vertical dimension," I said. "We are aware of the vertical dimension." "I know. You just don't use it. It creates kinetic inefficiencies that degrade your score in 3 separate metrics if your goal is the optimal ground level path," I said. "But if your goal is reaching the objective before the opposition can reposition, the kinetic inefficiency in the vertical movement is offset by the positional advantage you gain by being somewhere the opposition AI's decision tree doesn't model." Zane was quiet, load-bearing quiet, the 400-kilogram kind. "The course," he said finally, "was not designed to be solved that way." "I know. The vertical dimension was included as a topographical feature, not a tactical variable." "I know. That's why it worked." He looked at me for a long time. "How did you know we would not account for it?" And that was the real question. That was why I was sitting in a chair designed for a different physiology, in a room 3 degrees too cold, and not just getting a note in my file. I thought about how to answer it. I thought about 12 nights on a bunk terminal, going through every simulation record I could access, every training document, every after-action analysis the station library had from the last 40 cycles. I thought about what I'd seen in all of it. The Veth were extraordinary tacticians. They were also extraordinarily consistent. Every solution in their library was optimal. And optimal, I'd realized around night 7, was another word for predictable. Because you've been optimizing the same system for 200 years, I said. You're very good at the game you built. But when you build a game that's good enough, you stop being able to see it from outside. Sen's planes shifted. A micro-adjustment, the kind he probably didn't know he made. I'd learned by then that it was the Veth equivalent of leaning forward. And you can see it from outside. I couldn't see it from inside. That's different, but it gets you to the same place. Explain. I didn't know your system well enough to optimize within it. So, I had to find a different path. The vertical dimension wasn't something I discovered because I'm clever, it was something I found because I ran out of options that made sense in your framework and had to start looking at options that didn't. I paused. Humans are pretty good at that. Running out of good options, and then trying the bad ones until one works. The quiet this time was different. Not the heavy, processing kind. Something else. Something I hadn't heard from Zen before. "We have been refining this course for 200 years, he said, and his voice had shifted to something that wasn't quite his instructor register. Something more careful. In that time, no initiate from any species has performed as you perform today. I know. The records are in the library. Do you understand what that means? I think I'm starting to. We have, Sen said slowly, optimized ourselves into a position from which we can no longer see the boundaries of our own system. We are very good at what we do, and what we do has edges we can no longer perceive because we have been standing inside it for too long. He paused. You perceived the edge, only because I was standing outside. Yes, he said. Precisely. We looked at each other across the desk in the too cold, perfectly lit room, and I thought about what it means to be so good at something that the thing you can no longer do is be bad at it. About how the Veth had solved combat so thoroughly that they'd stopped being able to imagine it solved differently. About how a species of mathematical geniuses had built a perfect training course and then been absolutely blindsided by someone who didn't know enough to use it correctly. "What will you do with this?" San said, going forward. It wasn't quite a question, more like something he was asking himself out loud. "Keep doing it," I said. "That's the job, isn't it? Finding the vertical dimension? It may not work a second time. We will update the course parameters. Then I'll find the next one." Sane looked at me. The light came through him at the evening angle, all its frequencies laid out. And I thought about prisms, and about how a thing that splits light apart isn't breaking it, it's just showing you what was already there. "I believe you will," he said. Rael was sitting on my bunk when I got back to the barracks, which, for a Veth, was a significant gesture, because they considered sitting on another person's furniture essentially equivalent to filing a formal document of concern. "How was it?" he said. I considered the question. I thought about Sen's office, and the cold air, and the careful, precise way a Veth tactician who'd never been surprised by anything had looked at me like I was an equation he was going to need more room to solve. "Educational," I said, "for both of us. Will there be consequences for the methodology you used?" "He's updating the course parameters." Rael processed this. "So the approach will no longer function." "That one won't. You will find another." "That's the plan." Rael made the ice drop sound. Then he got off my bunk, straightened to his full height, and looked at me with the unblinking Veth attention that I'd finally, after 2 weeks, learned to read correctly. It wasn't predatory. It wasn't even scrutiny, exactly. It was the way you look at something when you've just updated your model and the new version is more interesting than the old one. "The cohort," he said, "no longer believes you will request reassignment." Good. Several of them have begun reviewing the course parameters themselves, looking for edges. Also good. You have, he said, with the careful precision of someone selecting the exact right word from a very large vocabulary, introduced a variable. I sat down on my bunk and started pulling off my boots, which were not designed for a species that spent most of its day on a ship built for beings with a different stride, and thought about all the variables I still had left to introduce. "Real," I said. "Yes. What's the Veth word for someone who makes you recalculate everything?" He thought about it. The kind of Veth thinking that was visible because they went very still, like a crystal placed in a beam of light. "We do not have one," he said. "It has not been a category that required naming." I looked up at him. "You might want to work on that." He made the ice drop sound once, twice, and then, after a pause, a third time, which I had never heard before and suspected meant something I didn't have the vocabulary to translate yet. But I had time. That was the thing nobody at Tessellation Station had quite counted on. I had the rest of the cycle